Welcome back to Judgment Decision Making. I'm Dr. Padilla. Now we're going to discuss realms of us versus theming. We all belong to multiple categories of us, and their relative importance can rapidly change. Think about all of your categories and which are the most important. Can you think of situations where the importance actually shifts? For example, on a normal day, I am a professor with a PhD. I'm a Bill Murray fan, and I'm an American. But during certain circumstances, such as the Olympics, the importance of me being an American rises, and all of a sudden I am so gung-ho about being an American. It's an example of how my categorization system in my mind shifts priority. Our categorization can be easily shifted. One study with Asian American women built around the stereotype of Asians being good at math and women who are not good at math illustrated this nicely. So half of the subjects were primed to think of themselves as Asians before math test, and their scores improved. These, of course, were Asian American women, but the first group was primed to just think of themselves as Asians. And the second were primed about gender, and their scores actually declined. Moreover, the levels of activity in cortical regions involved with math skills changed in parallel. So the actual activation in the subject's mind were in parallel with if they thought they were going to be good at math because they were primed by Asian stereotypes, or bad at math because they were primed by female stereotypes. The priming of race for categorization is flimsy. Well, we saw lots of evidence for people characterizing individuals based on race. There isn't a lot of justification for that. Race is a biological continuum rather than a discrete category. You're never just African American or some other race. There is a continuum biologically. The genetic variation within a race is generally as great as between races. So creating these arbitrary categorizations is truly that, it's arbitrary. Because it's a continuum, placing sort of sections around any one race doesn't make sense because the variation within that category is just as great as between the categories. At various times in the US history, the way that the census indicated race was that Mexicans and Romanians were classified as different races. Southern Italians were of a different race than Northern Europeans. Someone with one black grandparent and 7 white ones was classified as white in Oregon, but not in Florida. So that's to say that race is a cultural rather than biological construct. And there's subtle reclassification of the different types of classification systems that we use. For example, in the Battle of Gettysburg, this Confederate Lewis Armistead was wounded. And he was laying on the battlefield and gave a secret Masonic sign in hopes that someone would recognize him as a Mason. And it turned out that a Union officer on the other side of the war actually recognized that sign and took care of him and helped him out. This was an instant example of how the us versus them of Union versus Confederate became less important than the Mason versus non-Mason classification system. Here's a similar example from the Civil War where Irish soldiers put sprigs of green into their hat. And what was going on was the Irish soldiers kind of haphazardly decided which side of the war to be on. So if they fell, they were hoping that another Irish soldier from either side of the war would see them and identify them based on their green sprig in their hat and help them out. Another example of subtle reclassification comes from a World War I Christmas truce. Soldiers on both sides spent the day singing, playing soccer, partying, and exchanging gifts. And soldiers up and down the lines actually struggled to extend the truce after Christmas. And it took all of a day for the British versus German classification to be subordinate to something more important. All of us in the trenches versus the officers in the rear who want us to go back to killing each other. What situations lessen or exacerbate the us versus theming? One is with priming. You can prime subjects subliminally with negative stereotypes of them, and you can exaggerate the theming in that case. So for example, there's amygdala activation when white subjects see black faces in situations where there's rap music playing in the background, and you can decrease that effect if you play music of a negative stereotype for white individuals, such as heavy metal. Another example, explicit racial biasing is lessened after subliminal exposure to counter stereotypes, such as popular faces of celebrities of that particular race. Another is with cognition, and this is the concept of perspective taking. So in a study concerning age bias, having subjects take the perspective of older individuals more effectively reduce the bias than merely instructing subjects to inhibit stereotypical thoughts. And the way you do it is sort of ask someone to imagine yourself in the perspective of someone else. What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What are their goals and motivations? And that can help to reduce some stereotyping. You can also focus on counter stereotypes. In one study, automatic sexual biases were lessened more when men were instructed to imagine strong women with positive attributes than when they were instructed to attempt to do stereotype suppression, not stereotype. So again, we're looking at counter stereotypes as a way to sort of stop yourself from diving full bore into these automatic stereotypes that happen. This is contact, simply bringing people together. Now, there is some evidence that this works, but also some evidence that it backfires. So some of the narrow circumstances where there do seem to be positive results is circumstances where there's roughly equal number of people from each side. You can have a majority or minority. It really needs to be an equal proportion. Everyone's treated equally and unambiguously. Especially with racial interactions, the way that people that are treated poorly, that can happen in such a subtle way. So it's very hard to make sure that people are actually treated equally and unambiguously. Contact needs to be lengthy and on neutral territory. You can't just simply bring one group to another person's group and vice versa. That doesn't work. You have to bring them to a neutral area, and you can't just do it for, an afternoon. It has to be a lengthy exposure. And the goals where everyone works together on a particular project. So it helps if they have some goal-directed action that they need to take. The last one I'll talk about is individuation. This is being forced to think of them as individuals can make them seem more like us. If you can think of an individual in terms of, what is their family like? What do they do first thing in the morning when they wake up? What do they like to eat for breakfast? What do they do in their free time? What kind of sports do they like? All of those, thinking about someone as a person rather than a group, can be really helpful in terms of counteracting some of these biases. Okay, summary here. We have multiple dichotomies in our head, and ones that seem inevitable, under the right circumstances, can have their importance evaporated in an instant, which is very heartening. These things can change very quickly. To lessen the adverse effects of us versus theming, you can emphasize the individuation and shared attributes of other individuals. You can work on perspective taking. You can lessen hierarchical differences. I didn't talk a lot about this, but if one group of people is always, the boss of a system, eventually people are going to think, maybe there's a special reason why these people are always at the top, when there's really no reason. It just could be an arbitrary thing that's happened. So you really need to make sure that these hierarchical differences aren't playing into assumptions that we have about others. And finally, bringing people together on equal terms with shared goals.